The next topic on the list is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. But this is now there's a pretty significant difference between the ADA and fair housing laws. For the most part, we're going to kind of talk about this as we go through. But the fair housing laws primarily deal more so with residential properties, even multifamily properties. Whereas the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, it applies more towards public, maybe even commercial type properties. Okay, we'll see what all this is dealing with as we go through. But again, it's kind of dealing with discrimination. That's a no-no. But Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it said it was enacted in 1990, but it didn't become effective until July the 26th of 1992. If they were to ask you anything about the date, which I don't know that they would, but if they do, y'all remember the 1992 is when the ADA became effective. But this prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. So if you're hiring, and again, ADA deals more so with the public sector, business or commercial sector. Again, this, fair housing again was residential stuff. But if I'm looking to fill or hire someone to fill a position at my company, you can't tell somebody just because they have a disability, you cannot refuse to hire them, even though they would be qualified for that job. You can't. That's discrimination. You can't say, nope, you got a disability, can't hire, as long as they can do the job. But you can see where, they prohibit the discrimination in the hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, and job training, job application procedures and privileges of employment. It says it covers private employers, but it also covers state and local governments, employment agencies, and labor unions. So in essence, even though someone may have a disability, as long as they can still do the job, then you can't discriminate and say, well, we can't hire you because you've got this disability. Excuse me. Obviously that would be a no-no. So what is this disability? What would qualify as a disability? They say is someone that has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activities. You got to have a record of the impairment and be regarded as having such an impairment. In other words, someone can't just say, I have a disability to try to qualify for whatever. You have to have a record of it, maybe a physician, a medical person, or somebody that would have knowledge of the impairment might have to provide some documentation saying, excuse me, saying yes, you do have this disability. Okay. Here is talking about reasonable modifications or even accommodations, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you're hiring someone with a disability, if there's an accommodation that you can make, excuse me, I apologize. I don't know why I keep coughing, but that's what happens even when the camera rolls back. Probably more so when the camera is rolling. But anyway, these accommodations that might have to be made are, you got to make the facilities accessible, right? If you've got a multi-story building, you can't say all is welcome unless you're in a wheelchair. You won't be able to get in here. You got to make modifications to accommodate those with disabilities. That's what they're talking about in terms of modifications. But when, with accommodations, you may have to restructure the jobs or modify their schedule. Maybe if there's another position that's vacant that would suit them better, reassign them. Modifying equipment or devices when possible, so that they can do it. So you can't just say, well, you've got this disability, you can't work here. Not if you can make the modification or make some accommodation, if that's available, then you have to do that under this law, under the ADA. You've got to be able to do that kind of stuff. But it does say employers are not required to lower quality or production standards. They do not have to provide like glasses, hearing aids, stuff like that. And it says the accommodations must not impose an undue hardship. Now, first of all, again, to be clear, if there's an accommodation or even maybe a modification we have to make to the building or whatever, then you're supposed to do that under this law unless it would cause an undue hardship. Now, what's an undue hardship? It says it's defined as significant difficulty or expense. And that's the expense is probably where most people will draw the line. But a lot of it's got to do with the size of the company, the resources they have available, the cash capital they may have. But if it's an undue hardship, in other words, if I'm the owner of the company, you can't expect me to go out of business trying to provide some accommodation for someone with a disability. So the law does not expect you to do things that would create the undue hardship. But I will tell you, if you refuse or decide not to make some accommodation, you certainly better be able to prove or show it's an undue hardship if they should file a complaint against you. So I'd be very careful with that if you're ever in that situation. But again, we were talking about the difference between fair housing and ADA. Kind of talked about some of that, but fair housing for the most part deals with residential, even multifamily dwellings. Okay. But the ADA deals more so with public entities, kind of like commercial, if you will. But you'll see under this ADA, they have different sections or titles. And Title II of the ADA applies to housing operated by public entities. Title III applies to areas that are serving the public. But then, you see on the bottom here, this section 504 of Rehabilitation Act. That might be something they would ask you about there. That went into play in 1973. But this applies when there's federal finance assistance involved. So if you're trying to get financing, a loan, a federal loan, this section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act will apply. Again, all of this is geared around trying to protect those with disabilities or to prevent discrimination against those with disabilities. So not a whole lot there, but that's the Americans with Disabilities Act.